Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving straight into a massive, yet honestly kind of misunderstood part of the real estate world, measuring climate change adaptation. Specifically, we're looking at the exact reporting standards set by SASB and the ISSB. Let's get right into it, because the way we actually calculate property value, it's fundamentally changing.
Seriously, how do you measure a flood before it happens? We hear all the time about the abstract science of climate change, right? But if you're a real estate owner or investor, those threats, they're totally physical, and the financial hits are immediate. So today, we're going to bridge that gap between these sweeping climate predictions and the actual hard number reporting you need to figure out an entity's true climate risk exposure.
To do that, we're going straight to the source, the industry standards themselves. Back in August 2022, the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, took over the SASB standards. We're looking at version 2023-06 for the real estate sector. These are the exact, literal tools that entities have to use to disclose anything that might mess with cash flows, access to finance, or the cost of capital, whether that's in the short, medium, or long term. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit the climate risk reality, metric 1, measuring flood zones, defining 100-year flood risks, metric 2, structuring the narrative, alleviation versus adaptation strategies, and finally, translating physical to financial risk. Let's go.
Section 1. The climate risk reality.
So, according to the standard, climate change hits portfolios hard through frequent extreme weather. Think about it. If your properties are sitting on a floodplain or right on an exposed coastline, you're looking at some serious business model adaptation. We're not just talking about saving for a rainy day here. We are talking about skyrocketing flood insurance premiums, government-subsidized programs becoming super unstable, and creditors clamping down with strict new rules. Protecting your long-term asset value absolutely requires a comprehensive game plan. Moving on to Section 2, Metric 1, Measuring Flood Zones. This really breaks down how entities have to report their exposure. The standard says you literally have to disclose the total leasable floor area, specifically in square meters, of any properties located in 100-year flood zones. And you can't just lump it all into one big number either. You have to break the data down by property type, totally aligning with the FTC EPRA-NARI Global Real Estate Index classification system. Why? Because it stops an entity from basically hiding their super risky coastal retail assets inside a giant, safe inland office portfolio. You get the real picture. Section 3, Defining 100-year flood risks. Okay, time for some crucial dejargonizing. The standard defines a 100-year flood zone as land areas that have a 1% or greater chance of flooding in any given year. This obviously means coastal and river floodplains, but it also includes low-lying areas that are just prone to ponding. There is this huge, really common misconception that a 100-year flood is an event that only happens once a century. Well, that's mathematically wrong, and honestly, it's practically dangerous if you're managing a real estate portfolio.
The absolute key takeaway here is that isolated 1%. The standard is explicitly pointing out that these areas have a 1% annual exceedance probability flood. Crazy enough, some of these places have actually seen 3 100-year floods in a single decade. No way, right? But by focusing on that annual percentage instead of that totally misleading 100-year label, ESG analysts and investors can accurately perceive the persistent, year-over-year risk to the leasable floor area.
All right, Section 4, Metric 2, Structuring the Narrative. Now we're shifting gears from the hard quantitative numbers to a qualitative narrative. Because an entity can't just hand over a spreadsheet and call it a day, they actually have to provide a highly structured description of their climate risk exposure. First up, they need to identify the significant risks and opportunities. Second, establish the exact timeline for when those are going to manifest. And third, analyze how those scenarios play out differently depending on the property sector and the geographical region. It's a very systematic process. So what kind of specific risks are we actually talking about here? Well, the SASB standard requires entities to look at climate scenarios as defined by the International Energy Agency. This narrative has to cover a massive array of impacts. We're talking constraints on water availability, extreme weather events, evolving regulations and legislation, impacts on regional infrastructure, shifts in what tenants are actually demanding, and even the broader impacts on local economies and populations. Notice how incredibly comprehensive that is? I mean, if climate change damages the local economy, your real estate asset is losing value, plain and simple, regardless of whether the building itself took any direct physical damage.
Section 5, Alleviation versus adaptation strategies.
Okay, so once all those risks are identified, how does the entity actually respond? The standard draws a really strict line here between alleviation and adaptation. Alleviation strategies are essentially financial risk transfers. This means things like buying flood insurance or maybe changing up your lease structures so you're passing that risk onto the tenants. Adaptation strategies, on the other hand, involve actual real-world investments in physical asset resiliency and building out contingency plans. Think putting a house on stilts versus just buying an insurance policy. Entities have to carefully weigh the trade-offs, the costs, and the projected long-term benefits of doing both. Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, translating physical to financial risk. Ultimately, all these reporting requirements exist to provide truly useful financial information to the bottom line. I really want to leave you with this exact directive from the standard itself. It says, the discussion shall differentiate between physical asset risk and financial risk to focus on the risks, opportunities, and alleviation or adaptation strategies that are most likely to impact financial value. That's such a powerful reminder, isn't it? Whether you're calculating square meters of floor area in a 1% flood zone or you're structuring these complex climate narratives, the end goal is always the same, separating the physical threat from the financial reality. So, how does your own portfolio successfully make that distinction to ensure real long-term stability? Keep that thought in mind. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.